David Kaczynski, Ted Kaczynski. In the autumn of 1995, a social worker named David Kaczynski sat in his home in Schenectady, New York, reading a newspaper supplement his wife had asked him to look at. It was a 35,000-word essay against industrial society, published under duress by the Washington Post, because its anonymous author had spent 17 years mailing bombs. 3 people were dead: Hugh Scruton, a computer store owner in Sacramento; Thomas Mosser, an advertising executive who picked up a package in his own kitchen; Gilbert Murray, a timber industry lobbyist. 23 more people were injured, some maimed, among them scientists, secretaries, and a passenger jet that survived a cargo hold device only by luck. The FBI called him the Unabomber and had chased him longer than any fugitive in the Bureau's history. David's wife Linda had asked one quiet, terrible question: "Does this sound like your brother?" David did not want it to, but as he read, he kept stopping at phrases he had seen before, in letters his brilliant, isolated older brother Ted had mailed from a plywood cabin in Montana. One expression in particular, about cool-headed logicians, matched almost word for word. For weeks, David and Linda lived with the arithmetic of it. If they said nothing, and another bomb went off, the next death would be partly theirs. If they were wrong, they would have branded an innocent, damaged man as the most hunted terrorist in America. David hired an attorney, gathered his brother's old letters, and had them delivered to the FBI, on the condition that his role be kept quiet and, he pleaded, that his brother not face execution. Language analysts compared them against the manifesto and concluded they were looking at the same mind. On April 3, 1996, agents arrested Theodore Kaczynski at his cabin outside Lincoln, Montana. Inside the 10 by 12-foot shack, they found bomb components, journals, and one live device, ready to mail. Ted Kaczynski pleaded guilty in 1998 and never spoke to his brother again. He died in federal prison in 2023. David spent the years afterward apologizing to victims his brother never apologized to and gave most of the reward money away to them. He has said the hardest part was not doubting his brother, it was realizing that no one else on earth could have recognized him. Christopher Franklin, Lonnie Franklin. Between 1985 and 2007, someone was murdering women in South Los Angeles and leaving their bodies in alleys and dumpsters. The victims were at least 10, most of them young black women, and the killings stopped for 13 years in the middle, which is why the press eventually called the killer the Grim Sleeper. One woman lived. In 1988, Enietra Washington accepted a ride from a polite man in an orange Pinto, was shot in the chest, and survived by playing dead as he pushed her from the moving car. She described him to police, and then watched the case sit for 2 decades while the neighborhood buried its daughters. She would eventually get her day, testifying against him face to face. Police had his DNA from the crime scenes. For over 2 decades it matched no one, because the killer had never been swept into a DNA database. His son had. In 2010, California ran one of the first familial DNA searches in American history, looking not for a perfect match, but for a near match, a relative. The search returned the profile of a young man named Christopher Franklin, in the system after a felony weapons arrest. Christopher was innocent of the murders, but the genetic arithmetic said the Grim Sleeper was his close relative, and Christopher's father, Lonnie Franklin, a former garbage collector and sometime police garage mechanic, lived at the center of the killing field on 81st Street. An undercover officer posing as a busboy at a pizza restaurant collected the crust and napkins from Lonnie's plate during a family birthday party. The DNA from that plate matched the crime scenes. Lonnie Franklin was arrested on July 7, 2010, convicted of 10 murders in 2016, and died on death row in 2020. His son had never said a word to police. He did not have to. He had inherited half his father's DNA, and half was enough. Carrie Rader, Dennis Rader. On January 15, 1974, 4 members of the Otero family were bound and strangled in their home in Wichita, Kansas. The killer wrote to newspapers and named himself BTK, for bind, torture, kill. Over 17 years he murdered 10 people, taunted police, then vanished into silence. For a decade and a half, Wichita assumed he was dead or in prison. He was neither. He was a church council president and Cub Scout leader named Dennis Rader, living with his wife and 2 children in a tidy ranch house in the suburb of Park City, working as a compliance officer who measured people's lawns and cited them for overgrown grass. He coached his kids' activities. He installed home security systems, sold, in part, to families frightened of BTK. In his desk at church, he kept his private files. He called his victims his projects. In 2004, unable to bear being forgotten, Rader started writing to the media again. In February 2005, he asked police a question that has become infamous. Could a floppy disk be traced? Through a newspaper ad, they told him no. He mailed one. Its deleted metadata pointed to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church and a user named Dennis. It was strong, but it was not proof. The proof came from his daughter. Investigators obtained a court order for a tissue sample Carrie Rader had once given during a routine medical test at a university clinic and tested it without her knowledge. Her DNA was a familial match to evidence recovered from a BTK crime scene decades earlier. The daughter who adored him provided the final piece against him. Dennis Rader was arrested on February 25, 2005, pulled over a few blocks from his home on his lunch break. In an interview room, he asked detectives, almost hurt, why they had lied to him about the floppy disk. Because we were trying to catch you, one answered. He is serving 10 consecutive life sentences. His wife was granted an emergency divorce within months. Carrie has written that she still loves the father she knew, and that the father she knew was never real. The cousins, Joseph DeAngelo. Between 1974 and 1986, one man committed at least 13 murders and more than 50 rapes across California, moving through the state under different names. The Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. He stalked suburban couples, entered their homes at night, and was gone for decades. He was careful with fingerprints, careful with witnesses, careful with everything except the one thing no one in the 1970s could have imagined mattering: his relative's saliva. In 2018, investigator Paul Holes and the FBI took crime scene DNA and uploaded its profile to a public genealogy website called GEDmatch, the kind of site where families trace their ancestry for fun. The killer was not in it, but his distant cousins were. People who had mailed off DNA kits out of simple curiosity. From those partial matches, a team built family trees backward through the 1800s and forward again, narrowing thousands of relatives down to men of the right age in the right places. One branch ended at a 72-year-old retired truck mechanic in Citrus Heights, a former police officer named Joseph James DeAngelo, fired from the Auburn Police in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer, two items that meant nothing in 1979 and everything in hindsight. During his years in uniform, the attacks had happened in the very regions he worked. Investigators quietly collected DNA from his car door as he shopped, then confirmed it with a tissue from his curbside trash. It matched. 4 decades of dead ends, resolved by garbage. On April 24, 2018, the Golden State Killer was arrested in the driveway of his tidy suburban home. He pleaded guilty in 2020 to avoid execution and will die in prison. The relatives who unknowingly caught him had never met him. Some did not know he existed. A brother's memory, a son's arrest record, a daughter's medical sample, a cousin's ancestry kit. None of these killers was outsmarted by a detective in the end. Each was undone by family, the one connection even the most careful man cannot choose, cannot control, and cannot erase. They spent decades hiding from strangers. It was their own blood that told.